Back in 2016, Branko Milanovic, the economist, issued a fictional press release. He imagined that the US and Russia would go to war over the Ukraine. A food crisis would follow, followed by a somewhat limited nuclear conflict, with headlines that look like this. Now, this move forward to 2022, this scenario does not seem so hypothetical, does it? But I still think that some people would find it unease to think about a G7 that is composed of these countries. China, India, Indonesia, etc. Even though when you add it up, this country represents probably more than 60% of the world population. Why is it so difficult to imagine this? Well, because I think the international relations mindset still looks a little bit like this. The development sector international bureaucracies were designed in the post-World War era, and they were basically designed with the mindset that you would transfer knowledge, money, and goods from developed world to what was called then third world countries. This was probably not a good design in the first place, and it certainly showed antiquated where we are now. Now, we talked about at the beginning of COVID as a great example of bureaucracy stepping up, and that is definitely true. But COVID has also been an example of where this flawed mindset and design has resulted in scandals like the vaccine inequality. To this day, 1 in 6 people in low-income countries have received only 1 dose of vaccine. That compares to 7 to 8 in developed countries. And this is partially the result of a design that still privileges the interest and the power of a few against the well-being of most. Why is it so difficult to change this? Well, there's many obvious difficult reasons, but I would like to pose to you now that actually one of the reasons why it is so difficult to achieve this change, because these outdated values and mindsets are somewhat encoded in the back office operation of international bureaucracies. When I talk about back office, I talk about really unglamorous stuff like financing, the conditionalities under which loans and granted are given, monitoring and evaluation frameworks, risk frameworks, human resources, etc. And if we really want to change international bureaucracies, we need to turn into some of this back office stuff as well. It's not glamorous work, but someone has to do it. Let me give you an example close to home. UNDP, the agencies I work with, was created in 1966. Now, for those of you who are not, for the new generations rather, this is what phones looked like back then, and this is how UN documents were written. Now, back in 1966, we created the agency. You need to establish it in every single country in the world through a document that looks like this. This is a treaty, and if you look into this treaty, there is a clause that says, well, if you're a vendor and you want to enter into a contractual relationship with UNDP, you're supposed to relinquish your intellectual property rights. Now, why is this clause there? Actually, for a very good reason. Back those days, development projects were mostly infrastructural projects. Things like building highways, power plants, etc. And there was a fear that if private sector companies would build this infrastructure, they would actually charge back the countries for using it, basically establishing a monopoly. So this clause was put there. Well, fast forward to 2022, and development work has changed quite significantly. And if you are a grassroots innovator that, for example, has developed a creative new way to reduce pollution from stoves, and you want to enter into a relation with UNDP, first of all, you still need to speak English, understand the clauses, and potentially relinquish your intellectual property rights. 80 years later. Now, thankfully, the organization has realized this is anachronistic, but it took 2 years of lawyers, intellectual property rights, senior management, creating the will to create space to experiment with a different intellectual property regime. This is the type of work that I'm talking about. This is perhaps less interesting and flashy than having design or behavioral science specialists working with you, but it's equally important. And it's equally important if we really want to change and achieve systemic change. So when you look about the question, can you actually imagine and rethink international bureaucracies today? I would argue that you can see mostly three different strategies. The first one is do nothing. There's quite a lot of people who actually think that international organizations will slowly work themselves into irrelevance. Too slow to react to things. The private sector is taking space, traditionally taken by international bureaucracies, and there's not much that we can do about it. I obviously don't subscribe to this point of view, but you can see that it's quite popular in some places. The second one, and this is obviously a big theme in this festival, is about reimagining these institutions. Some of you who are in the breakout groups might have heard the work that we are doing in Asia Pacific on inclusive imaginaries, but you can also look, for example, at projects like the Future in Peace, that is reimagining the UN Council for the era of cyber wars, fake news, etc., etc. And then perhaps the other interesting strategy you see is people who are experimenting with alternatives. I think many of you in this festival are familiar with the Global Assembly. That's an attempt at creating a global citizen assembly with a random sample of citizens from across the world to deliberate alongside traditional bodies like the UN, World Bank, etc. And my personal favorite, if you don't know it, I would strongly recommend you look them up, is the Ghana think tank. What they do is they take problems from the developed world and give them to people in communities in the developing countries to solve. So imagine a community in Ghana addressing food deserts in the US or mental health issues in Norway. But as much as I like reimagining and as much as I like experimentation, when I actually think the real innovation at this point in time from where I sit, the real bold act is letting go of power. And this power often sits in these back office operations. And to do that, I think when you think about letting go of power, you tend to imagine something passive. I actually thinking as something extremely active, chiseling away at things like procurement, financing, monitor and evaluation, human resources, to see where are the remnants of a past logic that we actually need to change and reimagine. So at UNDP, we're trying to think about it this way. We traditionally put quite a lot of emphasis on the verticals, on our programs, and that's rightly so, governance, health, etc. But actually, if you want to achieve systemic change, we need to put equal attention to the horizontals. Things like how we rethink monitor and evaluation framework so that we don't assume that some people are doing something strange just because they live in a different country. How do we actually reimagine financing mechanism? How do we reimagine procurement so that it allows the grassroots innovators that I showed you to interact with us on an equal basis? Again, this is not glamorous work, but I would say it needs to be done. So if you want to look at organizations that are thinking in the same way, you can look at Flying Labs. This was a network of organizations that are working on robotics for development, established in the north, and actually redesigned their governance system to give up power to their network of labs all across the south of the world. A major rewiring of the organization, not unlike the one that Christian Bason was talking about during our opening. You can also look at Ringo, which is a project to actually reimagine international NGOs. What I found very interesting is they're focusing on the notion of power and how it is embedded in back office operations. So their first set of portfolio of experiments is actually looking at things like risk frameworks, at things like procurement, etc., to reimagine how this is done. Now, whenever I talk about this, I often hear, well, this is all very naive. You need to understand the politics of this. This is actually deeply embedded. Is this really possible? So I want to leave you with one image. I recently went to see the new planning commission in Istanbul. That's the city where I live. And their campus has been built in what used to be an exclusive resort for senior bureaucrats. District mayors that actually used to go there during the summer to take repair from the hot summers of Istanbul. Now, this campus has now been opened up to private sector, citizens, academia, to to go and co-develop together with the government the planning of a city. So what you see here is a swimming pool. This is where elitist bureaucrats will go to take a swim. This has been turned into a forum where actually citizens and government work hand in hand to plan and reimagine the future of Istanbul. So I think that letting go of power is possible, but I do think that it's not just a passive act. It requires a strong chiseling away. And I hope that we can really create a movement of chiselers, because I don't think that individual champions within organizations will be able to do it by themselves. We need a C-swell, and I hope you'll be able to join it. Thank you.